My name is David Sokel, and I'm the representative for the northeast of England for Christian Friends of Israel. However, I also look after the reps with the grand title of Church Liaison Officer. Not that I like titles, but basically we're there to encourage the reps of the UK in the role that they play, which is a very important role, as you heard Jeffrey speak about, and hopefully the recruiting of new reps. So if there's anybody here that maybe feel that God's put this vision upon your heart, but it has to be of the Lord. You have to know that the Lord's calling you into this. Maybe you want to see me. Another part of my work that I do is a weekly news report and prayer update. And with my wife and son Matthew, who you saw obviously with the flag on the first night, we've been with CFI more or less from day one and been a rep since 1995. However, for the last 8 years, we've been living by faith, doing this full time because we know God has called us. And you have to know, when you're dealing with Israel and the vision. However, you don't want to hear me speaking, you want to hear the next guest. And as a senior fellow of the Shalom Center in Jerusalem, specializing in diplomatic and military history of the Middle East, our next speaker is a CBS Middle East expert. He's written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. He's the author of best-selling books such as The 6 Days of War, June 1967. And he moved to Israel in the 1970s, and he served in the IDF, in the Paratroopers Division, the US 6th Fleet during the Gulf War, and was Army spokesman in the Second Lebanese War. He's also acted as representative of the Prime Minister's Office to Jewish refuseniks of the Soviet Union, advisor to Israel's delegation to the UN, was the Director of International Religious Affairs under Yitzhak Rabin. Just pondering, is there anything that maybe he hasn't done? I'm sure he's going to tell you himself. Please, let's stand and a warm welcome to Dr. Michael Oren.
Thank you. Well, the one thing I haven't done is address the Christian Friends of Israel. So this is a truly unique privilege and honor and a blessing to be with you all today. I feel a little bit out of place because I'm grossly overdressed for you people. And the reason I actually have a good excuse. I'm in President Bush's delegation here, which is very. And it's very funny. The White House calls the other day and says they give you an honor saying, you're in the president's delegation. I said, well, wait a minute. I don't live in the United States. Doesn't matter. You're in the delegation. So hence the dress, and hence I apologize for the inconvenience my host might have rendered to any of you today in getting around the city. Oh, my God. He's down at Masada right now and about to come back this evening for a gala event at the Israel Museum. But I'm not here to talk to you about George Bush. I'm not even here to talk to you about, well, maybe a little about U.S.-Israel relations. But I am here to talk about a person who is very dear to my heart, a person who is absolutely essential to the creation, defense, and future of this country, and a person who is much like you, a great Christian friend of the Jewish people and of the state of Israel. It's a person about whom I knew absolutely nothing once upon a time. Once upon a time, I studied history. I studied Middle Eastern history. I got interested in the military history of Israel, particularly the Arab-Israel conflict. And also, I was a Zionist. So I came to Israel and I wedded my two interests, military history with Zionism, and I joined the army, became a paratrooper, and fought in several Arab-Israeli wars, including the most recent war, the war in 2006 with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And it was through my engagement in history and the military that I frequently came in contact with a name. And the name was Wingate. Wingate. Who was Wingate? And my curiosity was tweaked. And I began to look for every possible book, every possible document, every reference I could find about this man, Wingate, and his impact on this country. And if you give me the opportunity, I'd like to share very briefly with you the history of this extraordinary and, I believe, divinely inspired man. Orde Charles Wingate was born in 1903 in the Indian Himalayas. His father and mother were missionaries, born up in the highest mountains in the world. His father, George, had been a member of the famed cavalry regiment of the British Army. He had fought against what is today the areas of Pakistan, but he was also a very believing man, a fervent Christian. He was a member of the Plymouth Brethren movement. Plymouth Brethren movement, some of you may know them. And there was one famous story. He was leading a cavalry charge on a Saturday afternoon, and Saturday afternoon became Saturday after night, and after midnight on Sunday morning, he called off the attack because he wouldn't fight on the Sabbath. Blame that to your commanding officers. Young Wingate, Orde Wingate, his son, was raised on the Bible. He read the Bible every day. He claimed to know the Bible by heart and could recite it any passage and verse, Old and New Testament. But he was a problematic child, had trouble sitting in school. I can identify with that. And eventually he was sent off to what they call a public school in Britain, what we in America call a private school, charter house, and it was a terrible experience for him. You imagine this is your classic ADHD kid who can't sit still in school, wasn't very tidy. The other kids would beat him up. At one point they lined him up and caned him and made him jump clothesless into a pool of freezing water. And he never forgot the insult of that. And I think he realized at that age that he would somehow grow up and oppose this great structures of the British Empire and the British society. And he also realized at a very young age that someday he would grow up and do great and momentous things. He thought one day he would lead a nation. And he began to read philosophy. He read Plato, and he read Nietzsche, and he read Socrates, and became very conversant in philosophy as well. But because he's part of this great tradition of the British military, he was sent off to a military academy, Woolwich Academy. And he became a member of the British military, an artillery officer, but he wanted to be an intelligence officer. And so in the 1920s, he was sent off to learn Arabic at the famed School of Oriental Studies in London. And his first assignment in the British Army was to go to the Sudan, to be part of their police force there, to hunt down poachers in the desert. In fact, he was not a violent man for a soldier, and the first time he actually confronted a poacher and had to shoot the poacher, he was violently ill because of it. Wingate was a man of adventure. You know, he was the second cousin of T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. Didn't like Lawrence of Arabia, thought he was a media hound, thought he was a phony. He was going to be the real thing. And he came up with this notion that Wingate would hunt for the famed oasis of Zerzura in what is today Libya. And he believed he could get there by camel. And he actually had a bet with a Hungarian count, Count Almashi. Some of you may have seen the film The English Patient. The man who gets fried, Count Almashi. He was a real person. Almashi bet Wingate that he could get there quicker with jeeps. Almashi won the bet. And poor Wingate, almost was lost in the desert, was stricken with thirst, left debilitated by his search for Zerzura. And it was coming home to England while recuperating from this trauma that he met a woman, actually a young girl, 16 years old. He was 32 years old, Lorna Patterson. And they fell madly in love on this boat. And he waited 2 years for her to become 18. And together they married. And they had an extraordinary relationship. If you were to see a picture of Lorna Wingate, your breath would be taken away. One of the great, beautiful women of her generation. I've met people who knew her, and they can only express awe to this day at just how beautiful this woman was. But she was far more than a pretty face. She was a woman of strong political and religious beliefs, a very well-read, literate woman, and just the ideal mate, soulmate, for Wingate in his search to fulfill his destiny. And his destiny was rapidly approaching. In the 1930s, Wingate received his next assignment. Where was he going in 1936 but to Palestine? He came to Palestine knowing nothing about the situation there. Wingate claimed that he never met a Jew in his life. He arrived in Palestine at the worst possible time. The entire country was torn apart by what the Arabs called their Great Revolt. The Arabs were striking both at the British, but first and foremost at the Jewish settlements, and first and foremost the Jewish settlements in Galilee, near Mount Tabor, around the Sea of Galilee. These were the settlements that were exposed to Arab attack. Now, keep in mind, Wingate was coming at a time nearly 20 years after the British had taken over Palestine from the Ottoman Turks. And Wingate entered this area at a time where Palestine, the situation in Palestine, was a direct result of Christian intervention in the country. And the legacy is that of Christian support for the recreation of a Jewish state in Palestine. And that legacy goes back to the Protestant Reformation, to the 16th century, particularly in England and in the Netherlands, where Protestant Christians offered a profoundly disparate interpretation of Scripture and of the relationship of Jews and Gentiles. You know, throughout many centuries of Christian theology, many Christians would view the fact that the Jews were stateless, that they were doomed to wander the world, as punishment for the rejection of Christ. And these theologians, these Protestant theologians in Britain and the Netherlands, looked at the Bible, and they read the Bible, and they saw where God promised to restore his people to their promised land, to rescue them from exile. He said that he loved his people and would bless any other people who loved his people. And these Protestant theologians concluded that God only speaks the truth, and therefore it was their duty, their divinely ordained duty, not only to assist the Jews, but to help actively restore them to their promised land, this land, in the land of Israel, to rescue them from exile and to end their wanderings. Now, my guess is that some of these teachings, they influenced many British statesmen of the 19th century, and going into the 20th century, very prominent British leaders still adhered to this notion of what they then called restorationism. And one of those leaders just happened to be the foreign secretary of the greatest empire in the world, of the British Empire. His name was Lord Balfour. And as the British Army advanced into Palestine in 1917, Balfour presented the British government with an idea. Why doesn't the British government make a declaration saying that the empire would view with favor the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine? And he brought this idea to the British government. The British government said, "Are you crazy? We have hundreds of millions of Muslims in our empire. We issue a statement in favor of the Jews. We'll have a revolt on our hands in the middle of this terrible war in Europe. We'll be finished." Balfour thought that the only hope he could get of getting the British government to issue the declaration was by going to America and talking to Woodrow Wilson. Because the British were so anxious to get the Americans in the war, they would do anything Wilson said. And in the spring of 1917, Balfour went to Washington, and he met with Woodrow Wilson. And after a 40-minute meeting, he came out of the White House with Wilson's approval for this declaration. Balfour brought it home. He gave it to the British government. The British government said, "Well, if Woodrow Wilson wants it, we're going to issue it." And that was the Balfour Declaration. P.S. Woodrow Wilson was later asked why he gave his permission. You know what he said? He said, "To think that I, the son of the church," his father was a minister, his grandfather was a minister, "think that I, the son of the church, would have this opportunity to restore the Jewish people to their holy land." So the British issued this document in 1917, the Balfour Declaration, promised to create a Jewish national home in Palestine. Then that document was written into the mandate which the League of Nations gave to Britain over Palestine so that Britain could fulfill its pledges. But what happened? The Arabs resisted it of Palestine. Every time waves of Jewish immigrants came into the country fleeing anti-Semitism in Europe, the Arabs revolted. They revolted in 1920, 1921, 1929. And every time the British sent a commission to investigate, and every time that commission came back and said, "We must retreat from our promises under the Balfour Declaration." And finally, this great revolt happened in 1936, and the British government was in full retreat from the Balfour Declaration, and no part of the British governing authority was in greater retreat than the British Army. And this is the British Army that Orde Wingate joins in Palestine in 1936. There's not a Zionist among any of his fellow officers, especially not in the intelligence corps where they were conversant and fluent in Arabic. They were very much identified with the Arabs. But Wingate, I believe, at some level, had absorbed this restorationist idea. He read that Bible every day. He was reading the same things that these theologians were reading in England and in the Netherlands from the time of the 16th century. But also, he had an open mind. And he determined that before he made a decision about which side he was going to support in this struggle, that he had to learn about it. And what Wingate did was to get a hold of every book, every pamphlet he could find on Zionism, on Arab nationalism, about the Palestine situation. He was going to read them. He locked himself into a hotel room in Haifa for 2 weeks and didn't come out until he had read it all. And when he read it all, he came out and determined that Zionism was an historical and moral imperative, and that he was going to dedicate his life to help realizing the Zionist idea. Now, how do you do this in Palestine with a hostile British government, a hostile army, Arabs fighting? The Jews have no idea how to defend themselves. Remember, there hasn't been a Jewish army in 2,000 years. Wingate came up with a plan. He was going to create a Jewish commando group. He called it the Special Night Forces, Special Night Squads, SNS. But how would he get the arms? How would he get the money, the equipment, the ammunition to do this? He had no idea. Nobody would even talk to him. Now, some of you go around the city of Jerusalem and you go up to a place called the Haas Promenade on Almona Netziv. You've seen that beautiful view? Well, at the end is the UN headquarters, that building. Well, that building used to be the headquarters of the British High Commissioner. And, of course, there was no park up back then. It was just a very simple road. Wingate hid out on that road one day behind a sole tree, and he waited for a car to come up. In that car was the commander of British forces in Palestine, General Archibald Wavell, extraordinary man, a one-eyed Scottish poet. And when the car came up this road, now get this picture, when he came up the road, Wingate came out from around the tree, went out in the middle of the road, and went stop. Car almost hit him. Wavell's guard almost shot him. Wingate went around the side of the car, got into the car, and said, "General, I have to talk to you about the plan." Wavell, being that type of unusual Scotsman, said, "Okay." He read the plan. He liked the plan. He approved the plan. Wingate was given arms, given ammunition, given a small amount of funds. They said, "Go ahead, go off and establish your special night squads." Wingate, in September 1937, shows up at Kibbutz Ein Harod in the Jezreel Valley. Why did he choose Ein Harod? From his Bible. He wanted to emulate Gideon, who at the spring of Harod had chosen his 300 men to fight the Midianites. And he chose the best men he could find. Among the men he found were Yigal Allon, later chief of the Palmach forces in Israel's War of Independence. He found Moshe Dayan, who at that point still had two eyes. He lost his eyes fighting the French, the Vichy French, in Lebanon in 1941. And he found, actually, 5 of the first 6 chiefs of staff of the Israeli army learned to fight under Orde Wingate. And he taught them a completely different style of teaching. The Israeli army, I would later learn today, is Wingatean. Wingate didn't want to wear insignia, didn't want anybody to call him sir. He insisted that everyone called him Orde, his first name. Even though he was a captain, didn't want to be called a captain. His major idea was to call out, "After me." After me. It was very different than the British Army. You know, the British Army World War I, the generals used to say, "Okay, you guys go over the top. You go." No, but for Wingate, it was always the officer had to lead. And he learned Hebrew. He taught himself Hebrew. Spoke not a bad Hebrew. He said, "Acharai, Acharai, after me." And that remains the war cry of the Israeli power troopers to this day, Acharai. He taught them to fight at night, very often at night, always bringing the battle into the enemy's camp, to act unsurprised. He had an uncanny sense of direction, could navigate without a compass, without a map. His men worshipped him, even though Wingate, in a rather traditional British English way, was very eccentric, extremely eccentric. He would wear a large alarm clock around his wrist, because in those days they didn't have alarm clocks. He wore an onion around his neck and would take bites of it during the day because he thought it was healthy. I haven't even gotten to the best parts yet. He would often appear naked in front of his men, rubbing his back with a stiff rubber brush. I actually spoke to one of Wingate's men not too long ago. He says, no, he never appeared naked. He used to wear a towel. And he used to seep his tea through his socks because he thought it gave it a gamey flavor. No kidding. Now, his men, the strange things, and I've interviewed some of Wingate's men, they didn't even notice this. They didn't even notice that he was quirky because they loved him and believed in him so much. Understand that these Jewish settlements were on the verge of destruction. They were cut off from one another. They couldn't get food in. They couldn't get supplies. Wingate taught them how to fight. And he brought the offensive to the enemy, and he won. The Arab gangs that were attacking these Jewish settlements were completely surprised that the Jews knew how to fight, that they knew how to handle a rifle. One day, July 1938, on Mount Tabor, at a village called Dabaria, Wingate was in a horrible firefight. He was wounded twice in the arms and the leg, but he wouldn't be evacuated until his own men were evacuated. He was honored with a Distinguished Service Medal, a DSO. But the British, his enemies within the British establishment, were getting angrier and angrier at him. He was teaching the Jews how to fight. How did the British know the Jews are going to use this against us someday? And so they contrived to make Wingate on a leave to go home to visit his family, to visit Lorna. And while he was away, they canceled his commission in Palestine. May 1939, the British issued the notorious White Paper, in which they finally canceled their promises under the Balfour Declaration. No more immigration of Jews from Europe to Palestine. No more Jewish land purchases here. The Jews of Europe, their last exit was cut off by the White Paper. Doomed millions of Jews to death. Wingate was beside himself. I want to read a letter that Wingate wrote to his uncle at this time. Listen carefully, because, yes, this is a man who wears an onion around his neck and seeps his tea through his socks, but just listen to this letter. The Jews are men of their word. They have always been so. In fact, it is the Gentiles' main complaint against them. There are 15 million Jews in the world. Palestine will take over well of 1 million within 7 years. You can have no idea what they've already done there. You would be amazed to see the desert blossom like a rose. Intensive agriculture everywhere. Such energy, faith, ability, and inventiveness as the world has not seen. I see the young Jews and the kfutzot and the farms. I tell you that they will provide a soldiery that is even better than ours. We have only to train it. They will equip it. Palestine is essential to world peace. Islam is out of it. We have the chance to plant in Palestine a loyal, rich, and intelligent nation with which we can make an everlasting treaty and will hold for us the key. Without expense or effort on our part, if we do these things, we will secure Palestine for the world. If we don't, we shall have put our trust in the bruised Arab reed that when we lean on it will pierce our hand. We are in for a war sooner or later. It's 1937. We're in for a war sooner or later. For pity's sake, let us do something just and honorable before it comes. Let us redeem our promises to Jewry and shame the devil of Nazism, fascism, and our own prejudices. Is that not a great soul? Is that a man with tremendous ability of prophecy almost, to see that this world, what's coming, the death of European Jewry and the breaking of British promises? Really a tremendous man. Wingate was crestfallen because he could not get back to Palestine. He and Lorna had made it their life stream that sometime they would come back to the Holy Land, that they would lead the Jewish army in defense of the homeland and help create a Jewish state. That was his vision, but the British army wasn't about to make it happen. Fortunately, his friend Wavell, the former commander of forces in Palestine, was engaged after World War II broke out with battling the Italian fascists in Ethiopia. And he contrived to have Wingate use his special night squad tactics in Ethiopia, taking a small group of men behind enemy lines and fighting the Italian fascists who outnumbered the British 20-1. And Wingate was sent to help the emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, who some of you may know, claimed descendancy from King Solomon. That's the symbol on his flag. The Lion of Judah is his symbol to this day of his family. And Wingate loved Haile Selassie, and he wanted to fight with him against the Italian fascists. He took a group of 32 men, this is an actually true story, 32 men into the outback of Ethiopia, some of the harshest territory on earth, and with 32 men, using the tactics that he had learned from the Bible, he surrounded an Italian column of 14,000 men. And, just like Joshua, he lit fires on the hill. And he had men running back and forth with torches, so the Italians thought they were surrounded by an entire army. And he sent down letters to the Italian colonel, this poor man, saying, look around to the north. You see our fires? Look to the south. You see our fires? You are completely surrounded. What a terrible waste of 14,000 men will be if you don't surrender right away. Next day, the most difficult task was to get 14,000 Italian men to file through a narrow valley and lay their rifles down one after another before they could realize that they were surrounded by only 32 men. But Wingate again fell afoul of the British authorities. As he and his men and Haile Selassie liberated Addis Ababa, Wingate said to Haile Selassie, "You are the Lion of Judah. You should ride into Addis riding a white horse," as it says in the Bible. And Haile Selassie says, "No, I haven't won this battle. You have won." Wingate was again exiled. He was this time exiled to Cairo. At the time when Rommel and the Africa Corps were attacking from North Africa, Wingate desperately wanted to get into that war. They wouldn't let him into this war. And he was sick with malaria, terrible malaria. He was taking this malaria medicine, and it affected his thinking. And one night, 1941, Wingate tried to take his own life. He took a knife and slit his own throat. And he was very close to death for weeks and weeks. And the people who saved him were the Jews of Palestine. They sent a doctor, Dr. Sereni, to nurse him back to health. Zionist leaders like Chaim Weizmann, who had adopted Wingate and viewed him as a son, came to see him and to defend him before the British authorities. And it was through basically Chaim Weizmann's intervention that Wingate was reinstated in the British Army. The British Army didn't want him anywhere near Palestine, though. Far away as possible. That time, the British were in terrible shape fighting the Japanese in Burma. The Japanese were poised to attack India. And if the Japanese took India, the war could well have been over. Wingate, fortunately, knew that General Wavell was now the commander of British forces in the Far East. And he convinced Wavell to take these same special night squad tactics and use them against the Japanese. And so in 1943, with 7,000 men in 3 columns and 1,000 bullocks, he crossed the Indian border into Burma. And he fought behind Japanese lines. Japanese lines, they thought they were facing an entire army behind their lines. He destroyed their telephone communications, their rail lines. He blew up their ammunition dumps. And then he virtually disappeared into the jungle. Lorna was informed that her husband was dead. Gone. In fact, well over half of that column was killed. Anybody who was wounded had to be left behind with a grenade. They couldn't take him. They died from disease. They died from thirst. It was just a chance that there was a plane circling over the jungle one day, an Allied plane. They looked down the jungle, and written in bamboo in the grass was "Land here." It was Wingate and several of his surviving officers. Wingate came out of the jungle weighing less than 90 pounds. He spent 6 months in the hospital recuperating from this. At the end of it, though, he was declared a national hero. The British needed a hero. He had defeated the Japanese in the jungle where nobody thought the Japanese could be defeated. And as a result of that, Churchill adopted him. Churchill loved him. And he took Wingate with him to the Quebec Conference at the end of 1943 to meet President Roosevelt. Roosevelt was very impressed with him. So impressed with him that now they gave Wingate thousands of men more, any equipment he wanted, and they said, go back into the jungle of Burma and defeat the Japanese this time. Some of you know American military history may remember Merrill's Marauders from World War II. Someone nodding their head, remember Merrill's Marauders? Wingate trained Merrill's Marauders. And they, in the late winter of 1944, Wingate went back into the jungle. And they crossed him with this huge army now, going behind enemy lines, completely disrupting the Japanese to mount an offensive, and the Japanese never mounted that offensive. They saved India from invasion. March 24th, 1944, Wingate was preparing to board an American Mitchell bomber with 4 British airmen aboard, 5 American airmen aboard. And he stopped to reflect what his life was about. He thought about Ethiopia, he thought about Egypt, he thought about Burma, and he understood that all of this was in preparation for going back in leading the great battle to free the Jewish people and recreate the state here. Jewish people here in this country, Moshe Dayan, Yigal Allon, the soldiers who fought under him, they didn't call him Orde anymore. They had given him a Hebrew name. You know what they called him? They called him Hayadid, the friend. That's it, the friend, Hayadid. And he wanted to show just how far he could take that friendship. He wanted to dedicate the rest of his life and using this prestige and experience that he had acquired in all these different campaigns fighting against fascism to help realizing the dream of Zionism. March 24th, he wrote a letter to Lorna, and I quote, "I miss you always, as I know you do me. This present ambitious phase of our lives may well end in obscurity. If so, beloved, I look forward happily to a life together as peasants in the land of Israel. Our life together has been a joy to me, in spite of failings and faults on my side. I am peaceful and happy and only miss you." And then on the bottom, he wrote in Hebrew, "Im eshkachech Yerushalayim, eshkach yemini." Should I forget you, Jerusalem, may I forget my right hand. He got onto that Mitchell bomber with the 4 British airmen, the 5 American airmen, and the Mitchell bomber never landed. It crashed in the mountains of Burma, far in the jungle. It took 3 weeks for a party to try even rescue the remains. There were several pounds of human remains mixed together. They were brought back for burial in, of all places, Arlington Cemetery. Wingate, who had been promoted to the Major General, is the only British general buried in Arlington today. Wingate would not be forgotten by the country for which he was ready to give his life. Today, you can visit the Yamin Orde Academy in the Galilee, which cares for the orphans of immigrants to Israel, poor kids taking place at Yamin Orde. Just up the street from here, you'll see the Wingate Square, just near the President's house, where there's a ceremony every March 24th by veterans, American and British veterans of World War II, and I'm proud to address that group every year. In the Wingate Sports Center, which is Israel's main sports facility, but it's also the facility where Israel's special forces train. My own son, a commando in the Israeli army, trained at the Wingate Center, right there. Extraordinary. He is remembered here, Wingate. And he is remembered by Jews, I believe, everywhere. Every time, I'm often in Washington. I'm in Washington next week. And every time I go to Washington, I always take the time out to go to Arlington National Cemetery to place a stone on the grave of Wingate. And everybody at Arlington, you go in there, just say, where's Wingate's grave? Everybody knows. It's one of the most visited sites at Arlington. And every time I go there, there are many stones. You know, the Jewish tradition, don't put flowers, you put stones on a tomb. And it's always lined with stones. And last time I was there, under one of the stones was a piece of paper, actually encased in plastic, so that it wouldn't be erased by the rain. And on that piece of plastic, under the piece of plastic was a letter. And on the letter was written one word in Hebrew, and it said, Leyadid, to our friend. To our friend. Wingate's tradition lives on not just in street names, not in sports complexes, but it lives on in the Christian friends to Israel around the world. It lives on in you. And it is a vital part of the success, the survival, the flourishing of this country. It is part of our blessing. We were blessed by this man. He taught us to defend ourselves when we had no idea. His spirit reigns throughout the Israeli army today and throughout the society, and you're part of it. So, with that, let me say thank you. God bless you. Come again, please. No, thank you. For Wingate. Thank you.
Please be seated. Michael said he's willing to take any questions you might have. I'm sure you've got questions, right?
Sure.
Right here, sir.
Pardon me? Wingate? Is there a story of Wingate and tanks? No, that's somebody else. Wingate was not here when that happened. That happened in 1948. 1948. Yes. Someone I can't see. So, yes, sir. Who?
Or Dobby.
I don't know, but if Duncan is here, he's a wing.
He was his cousin.
Huh?
He was his.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Lady up here.
I was giving a talk in Winnipeg a couple of years ago. And at the end of my talk, actually in a synagogue, a group of people come up to me and said to me, we are the local chapter of the Plymouth Brethren, and we want to thank you for what you've done for Orde Wingate's legacy. What a great Plymouth Brethren. I don't know if you know any Plymouth Brethren, but they are still out there. Yes, they are. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I think it was planned in advance already. I think they're going to give us the early warning system. They're going to give us certain missiles. Well, there's an issue of whether we're going to get a certain airplane that we want, which is also vital for protecting us, not from Gaza, not from Hamas and Hezbollah, but from Iran. And I think that the United States should make that gesture. They're holding back a little bit. What should you know? There is no ceasefire with Hamas. There can be no ceasefire with Gaza because a ceasefire is a victory for Hamas. Understand that. It means that they forced us by shooting at us to lift that blockade. It means that they are determining the course of the negotiations. We are in a weak position. Israel has many options in Gaza. None of them are risk-free. But what is risk-free here? We can send our army into Gaza. We can go house to house. We can go street to street. We can take out those missiles. But Israelis will pay for it with their lives, and we will be forced by Hamas to inflict Palestinian casualties, and we'll look terrible on CNN, and we'll look terrible on the news, and there'll be condemnations in the Security Council. You know how it works. But I personally do not understand why the people of Ashkelon, why the people of Sderot should have to hunker down in bomb shelters while the leaders of Hamas roam freely on the streets of Gaza. I don't understand that. Mm-hmm. Somebody from the left?
Jeffrey?
Congratulations on a brilliant talk.
Thank you.
Just the Americans on board.
The story of the issuance of the Balfour Declaration is very complex, very long. Much has been written about it. My last book is called Power, Faith, and Fantasy, America and the Middle East. It's about America and the Middle East, 1776 to the present. There's a whole chapter on the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration had many impetuses, if you would. One was to create a Jewish state in Palestine that would be pro-British and defend the northern and eastern approaches to the Suez Canal. There was an imperialist impulse. Another notion was that somehow the Communist Party, a lot of the British thought that a lot of the communists were Jewish, and somehow if you issued a pro-Zionist statement, it would keep the Russians in the war. Remember, the Russians were leaving the war in the fall. That was the Russian Revolution. Many people in the British leadership thought that the Jews of America, very anti-Semitic, controlled the banks and controlled the press. And if you want to get America in the war quickly, get a pro-Zionist statement out there that'll get the Jews of America to pressure Woodrow Wilson. Others thought that we have to worry about the Germans. Remember, keep in mind the Zionist movement was headquartered in Berlin at that time. And the British government took the Balfour Declaration and dropped it in pamphlets from biplanes over the German trenches to get the Jewish... It was a whole series of issues around the Balfour Declaration. It wasn't... The Balfour Declaration... Balfour had come up against great opposition in the British government, particularly from the one Jewish minister there, right? And Montagu, the minister for the colonies. And he concluded that if you get the Americans behind it, then that last opposition would be overcome. And it's a long and extraordinary story. Brandeis gets involved in it, and many Americans were opposed to it, including the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing. Robert Lansing said to Balfour the same thing some of these British ministers said to them. Are you crazy? We have oil interests in the Middle East. We don't want to alienate the Arabs. And it was really Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was the grandson, the son and nephew of Protestant ministers, of Presbyterian ministers. And he had this restorationism idea. He understood very, very keenly. And he went out on a limb and gave Balfour that approval. Something. Yes? Oh, there were several who were quite sympathetic to it. And Churchill himself was sympathetic to it. He wasn't in the government at that time. Many. There's a connection, and I'm sure those of you from the UK will appreciate this, that restorationism thrives when churches are full. I think there's almost an axiom in the world. There's a law that says where you have a full church, you have love for Israel. Where you have empty churches, you have criticism of Israel. you have the people who want to sort of divest of Israel. And Balfour and his generation were the last people real generation that were fervent believers, and in a great numbers. And alas, British churches have been rather emptied lately. And there comes the criticism. And so those, again, if you grow up reading the Bible, and you believe in God's word, then God is making his desire very, very clear in those books. I don't have to tell you, you know that much better than I do. Genesis. Yes? Wingate was 40, just short of his 44th birthday. Much younger than I am today. I think about that. I think about what Wingate accomplished in his life. Very short. Very short.
Yes, sir.
But just another thing, when he went to Quebec with Churchill, two British agents came to the home of Lorna without telling her anything, put her on a train, escorted her to Edinburgh. And he got off in Edinburgh, and there was the ship, the Queen Mary. And she got on the ship, and there was her husband. And on that voyage, they were reunited after being apart for who knows how long. And Lorna Wingate came home pregnant. And she gave birth to their son 6 months later, Jonathan. He never saw his son. Several years ago, I had the honor of taking Jonathan Wingate and his two daughters for a trip of Jerusalem, and the honor of telling their daughters something about the great legacy and contributions of their father. Thank you very much. I've been the reason I'm in the presidential delegation is not because of that book, though Bush loved that book. The former Israeli ambassador, Danny Alon, I met him in the hall last night, and he says to me, you know, when I first went to the White House, I walked into the Oval Office, the first thing President Bush said to me is, have you read Michael Oren's book? That was nice. But the Power, Faith, and Fantasy, the book about America and the Middle East, had a very, very good reception in the United States and also among American leaders. Last weekend, I was flown out by a U.S. Navy transport plane 900 miles out into the Mediterranean to land on board the USS Truman. What an experience that was, landing on an aircraft carrier, and to give a lecture to 5,200 crew members on the history of America's relationship with Israel. Now, what is the significance of that? 60th anniversary of Israel, Harry Truman. Can I tell a brief story? What time is it? I have to go to... That's over. Okay. America has a very unfortunate episode in its history with the Jewish people. America's